What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to everybody's favorite podcast for your one-stop shop on energy drink reviews and, of course, performance talks. Today, we're not doing really either of the two. We're really focused on our books that we love to read. But before we get into that, I want to introduce myself. I'm Brian. Of course, with me is the beautiful co-host.
Christian is my name.
And we're on our kind of second rendition here of a little thing we kind of started, and I'm really enjoying. It's our book club, Bois book club. That's one of those things that it's been really fun to do. First book, obviously, was The Creative Act. Second book, we've been kind of holding on to this one. We waited an extra week just to make sure that we had the time devotion to this. But today we're kind of going over a really, really good book by Adam Grant. Obviously, it's a New York Times #1 bestseller, but his first book that really kind of popped off, and that was Think Again. Christian's got it on screen right here. The kind of entire thesis of this book is essentially challenging your own beliefs and having to rethink them constantly to not essentially get stuck in them, but continue to grow and evolve both your ideologies, your opinions, what you believe to be facts, and then using that information to kind of construct the next forethought, the next sequence of thinking, and the next argument that you may have. Which is kind of cool. I will say this, the book did one thing, and that was start off really hot. That was, it wasn't like a book where you're going to kind of like really ease into things. Even the prologue is kind of a banger. Mm-hmm. The cool thing was, especially like if we kind of go through this as you kind of read the book, that prologue really pulls you into like what we cling to as human beings, and that's like the habits that you have, the instincts you have, your assumptions is a big one, and things that we don't really cling to are having an open mind. And this entire book, and essentially the thought theories that he has and the examples that he chooses to bring up, really kind of try to flip the script to like giving you back an open mind. And what did we just crack there?
Sorry, I know we're not doing reviews today, but I did pick up something because I got to be caffeinated and focused to review this book. Obviously, picked up a Rise grape Kool-Aid flavor. Rise has been banging with the flavors lately, and I don't think I've had this one. So
we're getting a review in extra. That's a bonus review.
We'll get a review in extra there. So picked up a Rise, the QT, this, and the old Sunny D.
The Sunny D is pretty good, and I'm not an orange guy. But the grape Kool-Aid Rise is, I think the only one that may beat that is like the tropical punch one. I like that one way more than I should. I'm not a fruit punch guy.
Yeah, that rips. But anyways, back to the book review.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just drinking a coffee. I'm a scrub today.
The book needs to be the star of the show. For sure. I'm being selfish. Mr. Kool-Aid Man's being selfish.
You're allowed to be selfish for the Kool-Aid Man. But essentially, we're just trying to bring in flexible thinking. I think as a society, not to get too into the wah-wah-wee-wahs and theories on people as American society, but we get really stuck in our thoughts. And as performance coaches, it's really easy to get stuck in your thoughts or seek information that confirms whatever you believe or your biasy versus finding stuff that will challenge it with good reason and trying to have an open mind on that. So I think this is a good book for any sports performance coach just to read in that sense and open their mind a little bit on how they talk about either their programming, their principles, their beliefs within the coaching realm, and trying to like essentially expand and have that open mind.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Before we get into kind of the meat and potatoes of the book, you kind of mentioned like some biases that we have. The book highlighted two main ones. One was called confirmation bias. The other one's desirability bias. I think a lot of people have heard of probably both of these, especially confirmation bias. It's something that not only coaches go through, but just a lot of people in general. Confirmation bias is basically just seeing what we expect to see. You're confirming what your beliefs are already. It's nice. It makes you feel comfortable, but it doesn't really push you to, this book talks a lot about how we focus a lot on thinking and learning and not enough on rethinking and unlearning. So like rethinking our beliefs, unlearning what we thought before, and relearning what's actually true. So confirmation bias is a big one that a lot of us, I think, run into. And something I also wrote down there is just kind of like echo chambers. I think a lot of us can get into like surrounding ourselves with people, following people, consuming content that, confirms what we believe already. And it makes us feel smart and good, but it doesn't really push us to rethink and unlearn some of those potentially wrong ideas. And then desirability bias is just basically seeing what we want to see. So they're pretty similar, I would say, but I think there's something that it's really easy to go and get into a trap, especially like I feel like when you're really like starting off, not so much, but once you get like a little bit of experience and you kind of start to form some of your own ideas, but you haven't gotten to the point where we'll talk about probably about the Dunning-Kruger effect a little bit here. You're kind of at the peak of Mount Stupid, so to say, and you're just looking at all this stuff that kind of confirms your bias, and you don't really realize how foolish you actually are. So I think those are two really good ones to look out for. The confirmation bias, especially, is I think also really prevalent in people in like leadership positions. Unfortunately, people that are like surrounding themselves with yes men and just want to be told that they're right and want people just to agree with them to make them feel like they're making the right decision. So I think that's something that's really important. Like whether you're at a lower or higher position, is you always kind of want to. Obviously, I think you want to surround yourself with people that have like the same values but potentially different beliefs, if that makes sense.
100%. And I think that's one thing we've kind of valued in where we have kind of like allocated ourselves to work. Obviously, I don't want to say just chosen to work, but obviously, have gotten hired and kind of been at. It's not an echo chamber of we all train the same exact way, or we all coach the same exact way, or believe the same things. I think we've both been really lucky to have, in a room full of 6 to 7 people, everyone has different opinions on almost everything. But it could be maybe the same foundational belief of the overall goal of having the best performance possible. Just how do we go about that? And vice versa in our friendships. You know, we both have friends who may be super religious in theirs, but in their beliefs, or super not, and complete opposites. And finding people and being able to have conversations that, whether you like it or not, may be uncomfortable at some point in time, allow you to grow. And it's not just about necessarily seeking feedback to get development, but just having that in your daily life, which makes you more comfortable in the sense of receiving those, I guess, challenging thoughts. And I think more people need to be able to be okay with that. And if this might be, you know, whatever it is, take it for what it's worth or at face value. But I think if more people were able to just say, okay, we're two differing opinions, we'd have a lot less conflict. And I think maybe not. I'm not saying necessarily like global conflict, but like just necessarily conflict in our lives. Whether you're getting together at Thanksgiving and two people just can't agree on something, you're still family. You guys can just not agree on that, and that's fine. You can move on. It doesn't have to ruin the holiday.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think another like a really good point that I alluded to that the book made was wrote down a quote. It says, "Who you are should be a question of what you value, not what you believe." And those are two different things. If you have your values set in place, your beliefs can change and be pretty fluid, and I think they should be. Um, we talk about like questioning beliefs and rethinking and unlearning, versus if you're who you are, what you think you are, is solely based on what you believe. That doesn't leave room for a lot of flexibility. Doesn't really leave room for much like growth and deeper thinking and understanding. So I think that's a really good quote. And I think even if you go to the back of the book where he gives some of his tips about like how to basically put this into practice, and that was one of them. Like focus on having your values in place, but having your beliefs be more fluid, focusing on the values over the beliefs. So I really like that.
One big thing about the book that, like I said, it starts off very hot. It brings the heat right away early on. One of the theories that he brings to the table is the kind of 3-2-4, and I say 3-2-4 in the sense of looking things through like their different goggles. And when we have opinions, we can typically fall into three what he calls occupations. And the goal is essentially to kind of get to the fourth occupation, but you have to first have an uncomfortable conversation with yourself of which one do I fall in typically. And I actually took this. I like this so much. I took it as like a small like thought piece for one of our meetings with my team at Team Builder and had them discuss some of it. So I thought that was really fun. So it's not just things in your daily life that you can apply some of this stuff to, but the three occupations were essentially the preacher, the prosecutor, and the politician. You know, the preacher is going to essentially sermonize their opinions, their thoughts, and continuously preach and hound on them as if they're trying to get all of that out there. Almost, not to say in a cult like bias, but just sermonize their opinions as if they are the word of gospel. You know, the politician may not sermonize their opinion as much, but what they're looking for is the public to be bought into them and on their side. So they're trying to get people with them on it. Whereas the preacher may want you all to just believe his gospel. The politician is seeking your validation and your agreement verbally, or, showing your consent to their opinions and their thoughts. Whereas the prosecutor is there to essentially argue all the time about your thoughts and show you why you're wrong. It's much less about their idea, but attacking yours. Um, and then the last one, which I believe, Christian, you do a pretty good job of being the last one more often than not, which is the scientist. And that is the person who is willing to self question, try to understand where you're coming from, whether you may be coming from a preacher, a prosecutor, or a politician, and then say, is that enough information to change my thinking, or do we have to ask a little bit more questions and think about things differently? But regardless, their first thought is essentially to question their own beliefs and thoughts and opinions and what they believe to be as true as fact, and question that.
Yeah, and I think we can all agree that like we want to probably get to thinking more like scientists, and that's a point that the book is making.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard because that's one thing that I think that true people that are actually like knowledgeable in a field, I don't want to say like they're experts because I think experts can get like a bad connotation with them as well,
Mm-hmm.
is they don't really speak in absolutes. They're never like completely sure that they're right. And that can be a little bit tough. That can be seen as like, oh, I'm not
Weakness.
confident in my, yeah, it can be seen as a weakness. It can be seen as like, oh, I'm not actually confident in my opinion and what I know. But I think some of that is healthy. Like you never really, why do we keep doing research? Because we know that there's things out there that we don't know and we want to find them out. It's tough to do that versus like, we think about social media. Like it's a little bit tougher, I think, to get out there and be popular on social media, taking an approach as a scientist. That's not going to get as much attention as like a preacher or a politician or a prosecutor, because those are a lot more like confidence. Think about like preachers. They may not have any like proof, but you mentioned cult leaders. The cult leaders don't really have any real proof, but they speak it with such they speak with such conviction and such confidence that it's like kind of hard not to believe them, even though like if
They
you
just
take a
have the
step back and
assurity.
exactly, it's like it's there's a quote in this book, I think also, I can't remember who it's from specifically, but it's like you have to be careful not to fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. Those people have like completely fooled themselves, and they're so like overconfident that they're really good at like fooling other people. So, and then you have like a prosecutor. This is one where it's like they're going to try to like straw man your argument. How many times like a person could have a good argument, but they're going to attack like the one weak point you have and
Over
try to
and
just
over
like,
and over again.
yeah, and they're just going to try to berate you over that one tiny little point to try to prove that your argument's just not valid at all. Um, which I think you kind of also get. I can think of some topics within performance that are some topics for performance that like people fall into there. It's like there's good arguments for both sides, but people are so bought into what they believe
what the
versus
to be
what they
true.
value that like they don't want to give that up. So they're going to try to attack and use, you know, kind of that politician sort of strategy to try to defend themselves, or prosecutor strategy, excuse me. And then
There is one really good quote. I don't know if this is where you're going, but because of this, in this like thought theory or this chapter, the one that really made me, it kind of really stuck out. It's that if knowledge is power, knowing what we don't know is wisdom.
mm,
And I think that's a kind of a little bit of a good segue into this. And that's not, what they're saying is it's not like go discover the new information of this new stuff to be wise. It's understanding that there's things that you don't know, and that's a learning in itself, right? Like say I was quote unquote not just knowledgeable within sports performance, but say I was an expert or considered an expert. Finding out the other stuff that I didn't know yet doesn't make me super wise, but figuring out essentially, if it was from a rehab standpoint, I don't know that much about it. Understanding me, like being able to look at myself and say, I don't know that much about it. Now I know of something that I don't know. And that makes me more wise in a sense that now I can seek that information out to either prove myself right, prove myself wrong. But most of all, now I have a different level of thinking because I'm like, okay, I don't know that much about that. Now I can lay the next groundwork to gain more knowledge within that area.
yeah, I think like the the more you learn, I think the more you truly learn, the more you realize like how little you know, and that will always like no matter how much you learn, you're always gonna know closer to nothing than you will to everything, which is just kind of a scary, terrifying thought to think about.
Thought
But it's true. Yeah, it kind of makes you feel like a piece of shit. But it's true. It's like there was a good graphic in this book that was talking about like the little circles inside each other. It's like, all right, the things I know that I know, the things that I know that I don't know, the things that I
things
don't
that I
know that I
know,
know, and then the
and the
things I
things
don't know that I don't know. And that's like the biggest circle of them all. That takes up like the majority of all of the things that could be known in the world is the stuff that you don't know that you don't know. So I think just like knowing that that exists can put you in a better spot to be a little bit more open minded to learning. And this is one thing we were talking about just before the show is like we really like the fact that the point that it brought up that like sometimes people that are really smart and really good at thinking and learning and picking up things are tend to be a little bit worse at unthink or rethinking and
unlearning.
unlearning. Yeah, and like tend to be maybe a little bit worse at like maybe changing their opinion on stuff. I think it's just something where it's like you said, like people just recognize patterns and they're really good at just like picking stuff up super quickly that they don't really think to they don't really
Rethink
think
it.
to they don't think to revisit those ideas or those beliefs. And I think that's like I guess that's one thing that I feel like I do a somewhat decent job of is like especially the more you're around people with like varying views, the more you're kind of like I said, like you're not really ever like completely sure of everything. And that can go too far the other way too, where you're just like, I don't feel like I know anything. But I think a little bit of that is healthy.
I think the other thing too, you know, when you're considered very knowledgeable, and I like again, I'm going to try to stay away from the expert from the using the word expert when we talk about this. But when you are considered very knowledgeable within a certain realm, there's almost a little bit of that ego that gets inflated, and a narcissistic tendency to be very, I guess, like self prophesizing on that front. So when you have the admission of, I don't know as much about that as I thought I did, or I want to rethink that, people are scared to do that because instead of being looked at as somebody who's going to go, well, they're trying to constantly better their thought process or understand more or become better. They may have been so far into like the politician mode that they're scared to lose that adornment in a sense to it, so they don't want to go back and rethink it. Like I think that the ego and the personal biasy of the adoration kind of get in the way of the rethinking aspect of this, you know? And I think really, really, again, obviously we always talk sports performance, but I think in the realm of sports performance, it's becoming a larger thing to want to constantly rethink and always be like, I'm going to get better. Even if you're doing the same thing that you did last year at 90% of what you're doing, you're experimenting with the 10%. And then that 90%, you're like, maybe there's a better way to do this same exact thing. And I want to evolve that and continuously evolve that over the years to come because it's never going to be perfect. But if we can make it a little bit better or a little bit smoother, we'll get there. You know, I kind of related in the sense of, when we talk sports performance, if you're one of the guys that I'm always going to talk to about probably true strength work or on the other side of the realm, like true hypertrophy work, whether it be in your personal life or for sports performance, like that resiliency stuff. That's like a bread and butter for you that you just, maybe it's because of the background of like when we first got into the field or when we first started actually just working out and lifting weights, like you were like, bang, like that just clicked and you kind of stuck on that. But like, even just speaking to you about like just you have much more vast knowledge of time under tension and how much is required on truly different things than I do. And maybe it's just how much you love Mike Israel, but
I like it.
but like, on the other side, it's like I'm relatively known for the knowledge of speed work and improving the sprint speeds. But I constantly, we were at a meet last night, not to get way off topic here, but we were at a meet over the past 2 days. I got to the hotel, couldn't sleep. I was reading through for 2 hours on just different articles on speed development and why probably acceleration is almost, if not more important than max velocity, which challenges almost every belief that we've been taught within the past 10 years in the industry. And for me, I was like, okay, well, that's number one. It's over the past year or two, especially with female athletes, I've started to believe a little bit more acceleration is probably a little bit more important, or like the strength work in the specific strength of that context. So there probably is a little bit of confirmation bias in it, but it kind of brought other things to light of like, you can't just run 3 flies and call that a practice, it's not the same thing. And these other aspects, and it just went down this entire rabbit hole. But not to, have to perform the narcissist test on myself right here, but not to tell everybody how great I am. But it was an uncomfortable read sometimes, but also at the same time, you kind of look at it and you're like, okay, well, this is new information that we can make it better. And if you're looking at it in that light, challenging your own opinions, thoughts, rethinking some of this and saying, well, there's probably an easy way that I can adjust what I'm doing in order to get a better result, et cetera, down the line, we can do it this way. And I think that's one way you can kind of remove the ego from it, is when you've maybe preached or politicized some of these opinions to get people to believe in you as, in the sense of being a coach. And we change this up, very much saying like, I wanted to seek new information. And now that I've sought this new information, I think I've grasped a larger understanding of this picture. And this is why we're going to do this. And being able to effectively communicate that to people, you kind of flip back from the scientist into like a preacher or a politician to then say like, this is why we're doing this. I'm going to try to get you on board and believe in what we're doing again, because I was able to find more information so you didn't have to.
Mm-hmm.
It's a weird thing, but
yeah, I also think it's difficult, like when people look to you as like a quote unquote like knowledgeable person. You're the person they're coming to with all their questions. It can be a little bit difficult to want to admit that like you don't know everything, or especially like when they're like looking up to you for information. But I also think that's what makes people a little
really
bit more
good.
relatable. Yeah, it's what makes them really good. So it makes them more like relatable, like, and different, different types of people are going to speak to different speak to different audiences. But like me personally, like I I appreciate people that are a little bit more like down to earth and like relatable. Um, I think that makes I think that makes it even better. Like when someone's like willing to admit that there's like also a lot of stuff that they don't know or like they're not sure about, but that they've like thought through a lot of stuff more than most people versus someone who's just like, this is the way it is. I'm 100% sure. I can't be convinced otherwise. That isn't like that doesn't make me trust them quite as much as someone who's a little bit more open minded. Doesn't mean that they're not like confident in their opinion, but like just willing to admit that there's like stuff that they don't know. So I think it's good, like you said, to have people where like you're someone that you're the first person I would call if I want something answered about speed development. I have other people that I would call if I want to talk about something else. Like I probably call DeMarco if I wanted to talk about like more leadership stuff and like organizational and like managing like other people. Um, yeah, it's good to have people in your corner that you can kind of hit up that are more knowledgeable in a specific area than you, or at least have like a different perspective on stuff than you, because it kind of makes you question those things. Um, and you can do this too with like following people on social media that like you may not like agree with, but tend to you can tell when people kind of like think through ideas a little bit more deeply or kind of like hit on the same things through like multiple posts, for example, that bring up some good points. Obviously, some people don't want to like take the time to actually like read a whole caption, but I do kind of appreciate when people, whether they be whether I agree or don't agree with what they're saying, like giving a good justification to like what they're thinking, and you can tell that they've actually like thought through it and worked through it like through like experimentation like an actual scientist, which like we alluded to earlier is kind of the thing that we want to kind of gear our thinking towards, thinking like a scientist as opposed to a preacher, a prosecutor, or a politician. um, Obviously there's probably other times for that, I think, to be those other three, but I think obviously the point the book made is like you want to be the scientist more often than not.
Yeah, I think more often than not, you should be the scientist, especially when you're in your beliefs. Now there are life situations in which the others probably are the useful occupation to then go into. You think of like a salesman; they probably want that politician, or they'll switch between the preacher and the politician, in order to
Mm-hmm.
make that sale and be fruitful. Um, we kind of talked about this, and this was like my team when they kind of discussed this is, they all really like the scientist of understanding, when we speak to customers and stuff like that. And then when we're kind of teaching them how to use the software, there's almost like that little bit of like psychiatry that plays into it where you want to be the politician. So you get them on board and with you, and they have this belief that this is, we're almost like re-justifying of the purchase and that emotional attachment to what they had just bought. So there's like those certain situations where you might want to fall back out of that. um, the One of the other piece obviously that we talked about pre-show, and some of the good one of the good examples that they used, was really for going over Mount Stupid, in the Dunning-Kruger effect, which we've brought up multiple times on the show before, and going over that. And then you have like, I think it was called like the Valley of Despair, and then the slope of enlightenment. Getting
Mm-hmm.
up that slope of enlightenment, once you kind of, you don't know a whole lot and you feel stupid, you go all the way up after you learn a little bit. You're in Mount Stupid, which is the top of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where you know very little, but you believe that to be the absolute truth. And now you consider yourself what we would not want to consider, but an expert. You find out a little bit more and you realize there's so much you don't know. Then you get comfortable with it and you start to learn more and more and more, and you get on the slope of enlightenment, and in that same graph, you can probably overlay like the confidence versus like the true competence, which I know we've talked about again pre-show, which people having, the armchair quarterback syndrome, where they believe they're so confident that they can go through and they could do it all. And they're really not that competent because they're just a novice. They don't know as much. And then there's like the imposter syndrome, which is the other end of the spectrum, where they may be really, really good at this and they have zero confidence in their abilities or even very just little. And I think a lot of, you know, the imposter syndrome, because it's very little confidence, can be viewed as a very negative thing. And the book used the example, I can't remember her name, which is a problem, and I understand that. But she was a politician running for office. I think, was it in Greenland or Iceland?
Yeah, I think it was Iceland.
And she was running for office. And although she didn't win, her approach with how she took it, because she just felt like an imposter, got her like 27% of the votes, which was a very large margin, basically making up over a quarter of the votes, because of
Mm.
just how she approached to it and feeling like she wasn't ready and or good enough in order to run for office. So almost like weaponizing the imposter syndrome to strive to be better can be very good. And you do want to get to, like, I think it was called like the comfort humility zone, or the confident humility zone.
Yeah, they kind of had that quadrant plot where it's like you're confident but humble, and that was like obviously a good thing. Let me see if I can
Mm-hmm.
find that quadrant plot. But yeah, I think the imposter syndrome is so prevalent, especially like in coaching for the most part. And while yeah, you probably don't want to feel that way all the time, I think it's like this book kind of highlighted how we can leverage that to our as a strength. Like you said, like it motivates you to like work harder, it motivates you to work smarter. Um, and I feel like a little bit of that is always going to be present and probably healthy to an extent. Um, I feel like that's something where it's like, oh, like we're always trying to like just not have imposter syndrome and like cure it, so to say, when we can be like leveraging that to help us improve our craft. So
Yeah, like it's almost like what you just said right there. That's one of the big ones where we almost want to cure it, and I don't think, obviously most of the time you want to cure something, not treat it. I feel
mhm,
like treating imposter syndrome is the best way to do this. And the analogy I guess I'm kind of making is like feeding it more information and feeding yourself more information to minimize the detriments of imposter syndrome while maintaining it, to help you to strive to work harder, to be better, all those things. Like, I think a small amount of it is healthy and good for growth, while not letting it overtake and swing you into this very low confidence aspect, is a really good thing. And
yeah,
maybe that's kind of like where that confident and humility quadrant, like where that baseline, or
mhm,
like net neutrality kind of like acts. Whereas like you kind of like gravitate closer towards like center on that quadrant system.
yeah, completely agree. I think another another thing I liked how this book talked about was like debates and arguments and how like a lot of times most people think they're having like an actual argument, but they're not really doing that. They're just yelling. They're just making mouth noises and yelling their point of view, and the other person is doing the same, and they're not really trying to be open to what the other person's saying because they have already made up that they're not going to change their mind in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a really good story in the book about like this like world class world champion debater, and he was going against basically like a machine, kind of like how IBM made their like Deep Blue machine to
Play
go against
chess.
chess, go against chess grandmasters, and he was on like the a really a tough side of a debate, and he it kind of eventually it went over like how he convinced people that his side of the debate was probably the better side, and it talked a lot about like because when usually when we argue, and like I'm guilty of this as much as anybody, like you want to prove your points instead of trying to find more like common ground. And that was one of the things that like he made the point that like good debaters usually try to find common ground and give credit to the other person's like points of view, as opposed to saying like, oh, these are my points of view and this is why you're wrong. He kind of said like, oh, like actually we agree on more than what we think, and here's why I think like my side's a little bit better. So I thought that was super interesting. as well as like trying to make fewer points in your argument, trying to make like 1 to 3 points instead of trying to make, 10 different points, because, the more you make, the more you're probably going to have some ones that are a little bit shaky. And then people are more likely to attack those points as opposed to just leading with like 1 to 3 really solid arguments, and kind of going from there. I think this is super prevalent, especially with one. I think you have like, obviously you're gonna have like debates and disagreements and arguments with like other coaches, but like specifically when it comes to strength coaches having conversations with sport coaches, when it comes to like whether it's practice planning or conditioning or schedule versus like how often you're going to lift, this and that, what they think the team needs. I think this is really important because you know how many times have we bitched about like a sport coach not understanding like our jobs, or not understanding like what the team needs physiologically, and not understanding why their conditioning test isn't doing what they think it's doing. But I think this some tips in this book could really go a long way in terms of like helping steer those arguments more to our side. One, I feel like finding common ground and like putting them at a little bit of ease, because I think a lot of times when like you're talking to someone, they think that they're kind of already on the defensive. Like most people don't like conflict. They're going to avoid conflict. When you're wanting to like engage in like a debate or an argument, they're already kind of on the defensive. So I think like finding common ground and like showing them that like, oh, I think I actually agree with this. We actually agree more than you think, but here's where I think we can alter it to be a little bit better. I think that's a really good step to like helping convince someone that maybe your way of doing things could be slightly better, instead of just saying like, no, I don't think that's right. I think that's stupid, this and that. So I think this is pretty prevalent to like coaches having conversations with other coaches.
I think so too. And like the one, you brought up like the conditioning test, like in that, was that a hyperbole? Maybe. Well, I guess it's more of like just an example. But
Yeah, that's
like in
real
that,
life.
yeah, in that example, like if we look at it like that, like I don't think either that, say, let's say a soccer player, and a soccer coach, and you're talking to them, and they have this insane conditioning test that may not really be what you would perceive as like good or truly measuring like their level of conditioning. You can come from it in a different theory and say like, I'm with you. I honestly think that they should be conditioned for their sport. I think we're on the same page with that. I think this may be a little early to do it, or is, if the test itself is like the argument, it's like there might be a better one. What if we slightly altered this one and just changed how we measure it, or changed the distance or the intensity, whatever it may be, you know? And I think a lot of people, what they're doing is, in a sense, like if you look at it from like a sport coach's mind, it's, they probably have a lot on their plate. They're managing their roster, they're organizing practices, they're recruiting. That's there's 30 hours that you don't realize, that kind of stuff, to where this piece is important to them, but they only know so much about it. Whereas you're the expert and they're coming to you with that information, even if they're in, even if their belief is them telling you what they want, their intention is bringing this to you to see essentially what you think without knowing that. Like it's more of a subconscious like question to you than anything else. So I think perceiving it as that coach, number one, opens that floor to have that conversation, versus kind of being like them, in a sense of like having some kind of vulnerability. They may be kind of looking, without wanting to admit it to themselves, to have that like discussion of rethinking what they believe. And if you kind of shut that down, number one, you close that conversation right there, and now it puts them on the defensive. But number two, you kind of close that conversation for long term to happen again. And I think like understanding somebody's points of view and remaining calm and not like on the defensive. I think that's two of the big things that allow that open dialogue within, in a sense, like it's a debate, but it's more of them like looking to you for answers and allowing yourself to kind of become that knowledgeable person to give them the information that they're seeking out.
Yeah, it's a good point. Another one that I talked about shortly after that was like good like communicators, negotiators, but like communicators in general. A lot of times I think we're trying to justify that we're like smart and make ourselves look good. But the point that the book made was like a lot of good communicators focus on making the audience feel like smart and the audience feeling heard, whether that audience be like multiple people or just a one-on-one conversation versus making yourself look smart. Because I think that's one of the things that like puts the defenses down a little bit and makes them a little bit more receptive to like what you're going to hear, as opposed to just like always trying to defend what their point of view is and trying to like save face, for lack of better terms. So I think that's another good point. I think all of this kind of this section in the book kind of just highlights the kind of the power of like argument and debate. Like I think if you do it well, it can be a really powerful tool to like actually discover what you actually think. There was a really good quote that I like from this book that says, "How can I tell what I think until I see what I say?" And that one really stuck with me because it's like you may think that you know know a good amount about this or that topic, but until someone really like asks you what you think about it and you have to verbalize it out loud, you really don't know what you actually think about it or how well you know it. It's another like good technique is like to kind of gauge your understanding of a topic is like how well you can actually teach it to someone in simple terms. But I think a lot of times if you haven't thought through something enough, that can kind of like, and you have to like verbalize what you think about it out loud, that can really like expose how much you know about it or the lack of, you know, the lack of information you have about that subject. So I think that's where conversations like with your staff, if you're a strength coach, or like we just went over like programs yesterday for our next phase and kind of just went over, you know, we would present our programs, we would kind of ask questions, ask for feedback and stuff like that. And it was a really, you know, that's a really good exercise, I think, no matter how old you are or how long you've like been in the field, because it kind of forces you to verbalize like why you think a certain exercise, and for this specific example, why you think this is better, and kind of like justify your reasoning based on like your actual knowledge, instead of just like writing a program, putting it through, and not having anybody like question you about it. So I think that's like highlights just the power of debate and being able to like verbalize. And I think that's something we try to do with this podcast too. I think this podcast helps us kind of like verbalize what we think and kind of like just to verbalize like our thoughts about what we think about certain topics. And I think that's just as powerful a tool for learning and like honing your skills as like, you know, reading or, you know, taking an online course or something like that.
I think so for sure. And I know you kind of mentioned a quote, but there was a really, really good one. Um, I'm snagging it here. I just had it on my screen. But when we verbalize the arguments, you kind of look at your idea through another lens, because you're not only having to try to understand it for yourself, but you're also trying to explain it to somebody else. And I think that's really good to understand whatever the concept is that you're communicating, because in case it doesn't come out the same way that you understand it, you have to know enough about it to reverbalize it in a different manner. Um, but that kind of brings back to, you know, maybe you find out that there's holes in what it was that you were believing. And it brings me to this quote that being wrong is the only way I feel sure I've learned anything. I change my mind at a speed that drives my collaborators crazy. My attachment to my ideas is provisional. There's no unconditional love for them. And that's why, like, it brings me back to like essentially like a little bit of more of a mental model that, you know, DeMarco's brought up really time and time again for us. And it's that your idea, like your idea is not you. You're simply an advocate for them. So you need to be able to bring it to the table and understand it enough. But when it doesn't work, you can't take a personal like effect to it. It's more so it may not be applicable or may not be completely ironed out, or you may have just been wrong. And I think that's one of those ones that, as you kind of verbalize it and you bring that to somebody else, you can find those holes. And that's why it's really good to have, for us, we have this, you know, we can kind of talk through our ideas and understand if something's not right or wrong, right? Not everybody has that. So they get this little bit more like personal affection or attachment to the idea until they finally bring it, they're trying to iron it out. And then they finally bring it to somebody. And now they look at it as there's such a time investment within this piece that when I do talk about it, it is me that I'm trying to pitch, not my idea. Like, we aren't our ideas. And I think that's a big thing for it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm writing that down right now. That kind of relates to another like good graphic in the book. It was like judging yourself versus judging your work. I think a lot of people kind of get the two mixed. Like, they're the same thing to a lot of people, and I've fallen into this trap too. It's like you think because you had either a bad idea or a bad take on something, or you fucked something up, that like that's makes you like a bad person, when really like it's just like you have to separate yourself from your work. You can be like not so great at your job but be a really good person, and vice versa. Ideally you probably want to be good at both, but I think being able to separate yourself from your ideas and not being super attached to them, and it goes back to like prioritizing values over beliefs. Like if you value like learning and like intellectual curiosity, intellectual humility over like, oh, I believe in this specific thing, versus I think that's going to help you to be able to separate yourself from simply your ideas and be able to kind of look at them from a more, I wouldn't say like unbiased, but a more like level-headed type of standpoint. It also kind of reminds me of a point that my boss brought up the other day. So like a lot of people, and this is, I think everyone can relate to this, when you're in like a large group and it's just groupthink, right? You may have a different opinion on something, but you don't want to say it because you don't want to be ostracized. You don't want to be that person that thinks differently. But he brought up a really good point about like, oh, like you, like sometimes you just have to disagree and commit. Like you have to say, like, no, I actually disagree with that, and I'm committing to that stance. And if it's wrong, it's wrong. And we can, say you vote by majority rules, and the majority votes the opposite way you think. You're like, all right, we'll do it that way, but I don't agree with it. And maybe that way works, and you're like, all right, it works. Maybe I'm wrong, or maybe it just means that way also works. But not being afraid to like disagree and commit, which I think leads us into a really good segue into another point that the book made. It was about creating like good environments for learning and like rethinking and unlearning. And it had a really good equation there. So basically like psychological safety plus accountability is going to get you a good environment for learning and growth, versus like, think about if you don't have psychological safety, you're probably always going to be like
On the defensive.
You're on the defensive. You don't feel comfortable like stating your beliefs and your ideas. It's not a very like comfortable environment where you feel like you can like step out and fail. And then accountability, like people holding you accountable to your ideas and like accountable to your values, versus like if you have psychological safety but no accountability, that's where people just get comfortable and they never want to strive for anything else. If you have no psychological safety, like if no psychological safety and no accountability, that just sounds like a terrible work environment. So, and I think that's something that I've been really lucky to have. I've really been a part of like staffs where I feel like comfortable, maybe saying some shit that sounds stupid, because I don't feel like I'm going to be like, people may say it's stupid and tell me why, but they're not going to like hold that against me and like take away like responsibilities, or like I don't have to be like afraid that I'm going to be in a bad spot. And then accountability, which is also super important, like people holding you accountable to that standard. Okay, this is what you believe, now you actually need to kind of like live that out. So I think that's a really good segue into that, and like how I know not everybody has that. I think this talk about Jeff Bezos in here, and how like Amazon is like very, I think that was the comment, like the quote you were alluding to. It was how he's willing to basically change his mind very quickly. And I think that they have like a lot of like psychological safety there because like they don't need so-called proof in order to think that an idea is good because think about Amazon. Nobody thought that like before Amazon there was no proof that a concept of an online bookstore could turn into one of the biggest companies in the world because no one had ever done that before. They didn't need like concept of proof. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't have good reasoning and evidence behind stuff. That can be a little bit different depending on what you're talking about. But if you need proof for everything, if we needed proof for everything, we would never invent and evolve and innovate. So we need to be able to kind of take those risks and having like a good process behind it. But if we're gonna need like proof on everything, we're never gonna do anything other than what we've always done.
I think so. And one of the big things is essentially going to be how how much of an environment do you allow for creative thinking to where when someone does bring that up, you kind of go, let's explore that versus shutting it down completely because maybe a different variation of it didn't work before. Or something similar to it didn't work before, and if you can meet that new thought process or that new creative thinking with more of like a try to understand it and will this work versus like no it's stupid don't ever think about that again. Those people aren't as people try not to, even people who try to be receptive to feedback, when you get met with immediate discourse of that sucks, don't ever do that again. Again, you're almost, they shut down. It's that, like you said, it's that psychological environment of there's negative repercussions to being wrong, so they're less likely, you're having perverse incentives for bringing the right idea. So it's like instead of saying like you should have thought of this before, or a little bit longer and iron things out to bring to me, they just go don't bring stuff to him because they're having that essentially that perverse incentive, and it may lead to a secondary or tertiary effect that won't necessarily be fruitful in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing that I wanted to ask you was the book had a interesting definition of tradition. It says tradition is peer pressure from dead people. And this I think is super prevalent I think this kind of ties into like culture and sport. And you'll hear people like saying like, oh, this is the way we've always done it. So this is why we're going to keep doing it that way.
Mm-hmm.
What's a good line between like tradition and like how that helps culture versus like changing that tradition? Because some people would say that like culture is something that's like historical, like this team has a winning culture. You talk about like blue bloods in college basketball, or like something like Alabama football, where like that's like they have like a culture of winning or like a tradition of winning. But when does that turn into what this book says, peer pressure from dead people? And what's that balance of, yes, taking things from the past that have obviously worked, but also like questioning things to kind of evolve for the future? Because I think, we can agree that like doing something a certain way because that's the way you've always done it probably isn't a good enough reason to continue doing it that way.
I think for that, on paper, and I think this is a great example, right? I think you bring up like winning programs and you go, this is the way we've always done it and we win, so why change anything? That if it's not broke, don't fix it. When I read The Innovator's DNA, and that was also a very good book, a little repetitive, but one of their thoughts was, if it's not broke, break it anyway. And that, in the sense, you're kind of looking at it from the lens of, is there a better way to do this? Like, although this way works, is there a more efficient way that we can then expand it? Because maybe, and if you look at it from this, like, maybe we win conference championships. Can we be winning nationals? Things like that. And if I'm not spending 20 hours on this, but I can spend 15, I get 5 hours back to then use elsewhere on the next step of development. And I think that's a good way to look at it. Just because you've won right now, and just because something's been good right now, doesn't mean it can't be better. And that's a lot of the times mainly due to things outside of your control, or you've done really well despite that thing, not because of it, but you've made up elsewhere because you've had compensations within the organization that have really made up for that, versus kind of looking at it and going, we're really good. I think we should just kind of keep don't rock the boat. And like how the book kind of stated, I think again kind of stated, like, people up top, they don't want boat rockers, they want bootlickers, right? Maybe you need a couple more boat rockers in your system. People who are going to say, although this is kind of working, we need to cut XYZ, or we need to change XYZ and move it to this way because this can be better. Because I've seen a way that this doesn't turn out well in the end, or I've seen a better way to do this, or I thought of this way. you know, I think that level of open mindedness, especially in terms of when you kind of bring it in the eyes of like tradition, is very, very, number one, helpful, but also extremely important, you know? And we can look at it like from the selves of like our careers. The typical career is you intern, you GA, you part time, you full time assistant, you become an assistant director, then you become a director. I think we're two good examples of literally not doing any of that. We both interned, went to a part time role, and then moved up from there. Like we skipped the GA spot entirely. For myself, after part time, I went to a director accidentally, and then reshifted and came back. Like my path was completely non-linear, and yours went literally intern for the shortest amount of time possible as to be refined to part-time to really expanding it, and then to moving on to a full-time spot, and then continuously progressing.
Yep.
Those are one's ways. That in my opinion, that's one way that tradition is wrong in the sense, and it's not necessarily the only way to do something, that there's other ways that can be more efficient and beneficial. And I think it has to be treated on more of a case by case basis than a blanket statement. And, you look at, again, like a winning program, and you say, well, this is the way we've always done it. They tried to do that at Alabama, man, and Alabama didn't fucking win after Nick Saban went. They won despite a lot of those things because Nick Saban is probably the best college coach to ever walk through college football. They didn't win because of all the extra traditions they had. Those traditions stood long after the man had left, and they didn't have the same result. So something else was there that made them win, and this is maybe what's broken in the system that they won despite of. And I think if you look at that, obviously, n doesn't always equal one, but that's a great example of a microcosm of this theory, and that we should inherently try to break traditions, or at least perfect them, or look at them through a different light in order to move the needle forward.
Yeah, to keep the college football going. I mean, we live in a world where Indiana just won the college football national championship. So if that's not,
Their tradition is losing.
yeah, their tradition is being bottom feeders of the Big Ten. It is like, it's bizarre that we live in a world where they just went undefeated and won the national championship and had a Heisman Trophy winner. So
Because they had someone who was willing to challenge everything and say this isn't right.
that's right.
I can't imagine I never worked with them, but I can't imagine a guy like, bless you, like a guy like Kurt Signetti walked into Indiana and said, well, I'm keeping every tradition that we have right now, and we're just going to insert myself into the process, and we'll just see what happens. He probably went through top to bottom within his first 2 weeks there and said, this is broke, this is broke, this is broke, this is broke. Here's what we're going to do about it. And I also don't think that he probably doesn't have anybody on his staff that's probably going to challenge any thoughts that he has that they may see is broken too. And he's probably got an open mind enough to he's a stern dude, don't get me wrong, but I guarantee you if someone comes to him with a good idea, he's not going to be the person that's going to immediately shut it down and say, get out of my office. That's not how I run things. He looks like a guy who's going to go, how is that going to work? I think that right there staying on the college football train, like you're going to see people who then become very engaged with what they're doing with their feedback loops. B, you know, they have a leader who's not necessarily dismissive of their concerns or their ideas, but he's also just not necessarily coming through. And as soon as someone brings up anything, every alarm bell sounding off and he's freaking out. He's trying to distinguish what information is important and vital, what idea needs to be proceeded with, and having enough people around him to, I guess, coincide with his thought process as the underlying principle of we need to win, as well as having conflicting opinions on how things should operate and listening to them and proceeding with it.
It's a
And
really
lo
good
and
point.
behold, super successful.
Yes. I want to touch on a couple more points and then kind of get into, I like this little section he did at the end of the book called Actions for Impact, where he gave some like practical tips. We go through some of the like favorite ones that I liked. I've said a lot of quotes from this book. There's a lot of really good ones. This one, albeit with a little bit of, I will have to admit, this is a little bit of confirmation bias. This is something that I've kind of thought a little bit differently than other people, at least like from my point of view. And I think you hear a lot of people like talking about like plans. We've talked about New Year's resolutions on the show before, about like having, it always kind of drove me crazy how people would have like super long-term plans for their life. And like I've definitely tried it before, and I just thought it was like, dude, there's no point. Like I can't even like predict what's going to happen tomorrow versus like where I want to be in 10 years. Some people may think different, but there was a really good quote towards the end of the book that says, writing out a plan for your life is like driving in the fog at night. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. And that was like a really good, like I said, this is like confirmation bias, like thinking like this is like, I agree with this 100%. Like I couldn't have predicted like a lot of stuff that's happened in my life. So like, I just feel like when people want to say, I want to do this, then this, then this by this age at this point in time, you can't force stuff like that. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I think it's still helpful to have goals, but I think the goals for me, like a lot of people like coaches have outcome goals. They want to win. They want this specific position at this specific school or this specific level within this specific sport. You can control that to an extent by like just being good at your job, but a lot of that is out of your control.
Mm-hmm.
I think a better take on like goals and like planning, I guess if we're going to talk about this quote, is having to be more like process oriented versus outcome oriented. And obviously that can be a lot more broad, and some people don't like that. But I don't know, what are your takes on that as someone who's, you're obviously a very driven person. Has it been like that for you where it's like, I want to do this by this age? Do you think that's good or bad? What do you think about that?
As much as I want to say I'm a process oriented guy, I'm a very outcome driven human being. We either failed it or we succeeded at it. Now, I think the outcome goals that you have is I want to win. I want to be, they're vague, right? What is winning? Do you want to win conference? Do you want to win nationals? Do you want to win this meet? Do you want to win this race? Do you want to win this game? I want to be a winner. I want to be winner, successful, and I want to be happy. They're very vague. And I think intentionally I make them vague because they're not necessarily a smart goal, because if you are so enveloped in what happens at the end, you get lost in the middle. And then it becomes, what's the process to get there? And I think that's where those more refined goals happen. I want to have XYZ for practices. I want intentful athletes. Okay, how do I make them intentful? And then you just keep breaking it down. I want to bring, that's recruiting. That's bringing in the right people who want to be challenged, want to get better, want to develop. Okay, so that's my next goal is how do I bring in, it's a question versus a statement of how do I bring in the most refined athlete that still wants to develop? What kind of characteristics am I looking for? Now, how do I go about that? Well, I need to be, every day I need to be taking, 10, 15 minutes and looking through the lists, you know, as we practice, I need to make sure that my athletes do X, Y, Z. I need to make sure that we're intentful. If you look at like a personal life, it's like, well, what are those end outcomes that you look for? I want a beautiful house with a beautiful family, and I want to be able to come home and be happy every day. But what are the things that you require in order to have that? You probably need one, the house or the money to buy a house. You probably need some kind of significant other if you want a family. Okay, so I look at it like that. It's like, am I, it always comes back to almost like to asking more questions than you are providing answers. And it's number one, do I make enough money? If not, how can I improve myself to make more money? And then you get another process goal underneath it. So like if I wrote them out, I'd look like Charlie Day and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where he's just got the like 15,000 like writings on the wall and he looks crazy. But I think it comes a lot from like a daily questioning of yourself. And it's a very uncomfortable thing to do. It's like, am I doing enough? Number one, what is enough? And and then from there, it's like, did I honestly devote enough time and show that like someone should actually be around me, 24/7? Okay, if not, what is my problem? Do I have personality traits that are not likable? I'll answer that before anyone else does. The answer is yes. Um, you know, am I doing enough? Is usually the question that I kind of come back to, and it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, what is enough? And I don't think there's ever really an answer for that. I think,
It's never enough.
yeah, I think it's never enough, and
Truly.
it sounds so cliche and stupid, but like you can have the best personal life in the world and you suck at your career, but you're doing probably enough to get by, but is it enough to be happy and content with yourself? you know and not to go to 2016 YouTubers that like probably influenced a lot of our opinions and formation of our personalities growing up, but like I go back to like Christian Guzman with Alpha Elite, and like their mantra is proud but never satisfied. And for me, and obviously like now it's like learn more, be more, dream more, do more. But like the proud but never satisfied is like you can be so proud of your own accomplishments, but if you're satisfied with that, you'll probably get to a contentfulness that you get complacency. And I think I'm I'm more terrified of complacency than I am of than I am like wanting of success. Because at the end of the day, I don't know what happens when we die. Not to get like super like, I guess philosophical, but like I don't know. So we have to make the most out of this, and that's I make the joke of like, hey, that's why I don't sleep, because it's like there's so much that you can still be doing throughout the day, and I feel like I don't want to miss that. And I spend a lot of time on my career, whether it be either side of it, coaching or within like team builder in essentially the tech industry. But I want to be successful, and if I'm not going to do it well, I don't really want to do it. So I'm going to try to keep doing it well. And then like your personal life, it's like as much of a loner as I can be at sometimes. Like I live for the hang, And this is Evan Mills, and I want to get Evan on the podcast so fucking bad because I think he'd be incredible. So shout out our boy Millsy. But like he brought this up and he's like, dude, I live for the hang. He's like, I don't like playing video games by myself. I like playing with my friends. I like when, I'm gonna go watch a football game and we get together and we eat food and have a couple beers and hang out and BS. He's like, lifting by yourself sucks. It's more fun. You get more out of it when you're lifting with your friends. He's like, that's the hang. You live for that. So you put yourself in situations in order to have that. And that's that social life aspect. Same thing with whatever relationship that you have, right? You don't want to be like, okay, like you're around me. You want them to be happy. You want them to be happy with you. You want to be happy with them, vice versa. But it all boils down to essentially a very uncomfortable question that may lead to social anxiety in myself or some people, to where is it ever truly enough? You know? And for some people, it is, and that's fine. But you can kind of go do that. But I think that absolute like painstaking fear of complacency truly drives me forward. And maybe that's, if a therapist looked at me and said that's probably something that you're dealing with that we should talk about, but it's gotten me this far, and I kind of like the feeling of continuously striving to fight against complacency. And I think overall, healthy or unhealthy, I think that's what's led me down this path within that, like developing far more process oriented goals than the outcome driven based things of like what's a small change I can do every single day that will help fight complacency. Is it reading? Is it questioning my thoughts? Is it working on or testing programming? Is it perfecting my craft on an email or how I lead others within that? It's like, and you just look at these situations that you have that come into play every single day of, you know, when you oversee 8 to 10 people, it's like, did you talk to them and get them through this piece? Did you get them through this? How do we want to go through that? I think that's a big thing.
That was incredible. I think
I don't know if that's incredible, but yeah.
I love it. I'm all for it. I'm all for it. I mentioned there's a section at the back of the book called Actions for Impact. I just kind of wanted to highlight some of my favorite, kind of practical takeaways that he said that you can do in your daily life. Just kind of read them off. I think he has 30. I took like 5 or 6 that I really like. I alluded to this a few times in the podcast, but define your identity in terms of values, not opinions. So it's easier to avoid getting stuck in your past beliefs if you don't become too attached to them as a part of your present self-concept. Kind of like DeMarco said, you're not your ideas. You're just an advocate for them. So I think that's a really good one. Another one, this was beware of getting stranded at the summit of Mount Stupid. And kind of an underlying idea of that is to prevent overconfidence in your knowledge. Reflect on how well you can explain a given subject. We've talked about this before. Being able to teach something to someone is like a good gauge of like true understanding. So I think that's a helpful exercise. Then, this is a good one too. Stop asking kids what they want to be when they grow up. They don't have to define themselves in terms of a career. A single identity can close doors to alternatives. I think that's like very helpful for career-wise too. Like you might have like an end goal, but don't be like too tied to it. Be tied to like just doing the best job you can, and then kind of let the rest fall into place. Abandon best practices. Best practices suggest that the ideal routines are already in place. And if we think we already have the best practices, what's the motivation to continue to strive and improve them? So I think better practices are a better term for that, and just always trying to improve upon those. Throw out the 10-year plan. That's kind of the last quote I kind of alluded to was, long-term planning. Maybe it works for some people, maybe not for others. Schedule a life checkup was another one. So it's easy to get caught in an escalation of commitment to an unfulfilling path. Just like you schedule health checkups with your doctor, it's worth having a life checkup on your calendar once or twice a year to assess how much you're learning, how your beliefs are evolving, and whether you're actually enjoying, what you want to be doing, or whether that warrants some rethinking. So that's all I got on this book. Really good book. Would definitely recommend Think Again by Adam Grant. He has a few other books that are really solid too. Hidden Potential is another one that I really like.
Want to get into that one really bad.
Yeah, I still want to read. I think it's called The Originals by Adam Grant. I have not read that one. That was kind of one of his early books that kind of put him on the map. So really good author. I enjoyed the book. I enjoy doing these kind of book reviews every 6 to 8 weeks or so. I think it's something that we're really going to continue to do. I think it's good to obviously keep us on track with like learning. It's something we can like do together, and then hopefully have some good takeaways for you guys on the show. So
absolutely. Can we please get a review on that grape Kool-Aid?
Meanwhile, I gassed this whole thing. Dude, this thing is good. Rise really doesn't miss with their flavors. You know, they have the official collab, so it's going to be good. Grape Kool-Aid flavor. First time I've ever had it. Had a lot of other Rise flavors. They've all been really, really good. You know, even their cotton candy, which I'm not a big fan of cotton candy, was probably the best cotton candy flavor I've had. Actually had that one on the last episode, so I've kind of been on a Rise kick lately. The price, really good. Got this at like a 2 for $5 at a Quick Trip. Shout out Quick Trip. Can't beat that. Can't beat that. 200 milligrams of caffeine, 200 milligrams of choline. Pretty good formula. I'd say it's kind of like a sleeper formula behind like Gorilla Mind, Bum, Ghost. This is like a sneaky like top 5 formula in terms of energy drinks.
It really kind of sits with like first form. Like you don't expect it to be as powered up as you see it on the label, and it just wows you.
Yeah, the can. I think the Rise logo is sick. It's like clean, sharp. I really like it. Obviously, they have the Kool-Aid brand in there. Shout out Kool-Aid Man. The taste also really good. I think overall, I would give this thing like I'm gonna give this thing like a 7.7. It's not like my favorite Rise flavor, but it is still really, really solid. I'm looking forward to trying the Sunny D flavor, which I also picked up with this, and then as you talked about earlier, the original Kool-Aid fruit punch flavor. I saw that one and get my hands on that one, especially if you say that you like that. And I know you're not a huge fan of like just androgynous fruit punch flavors. That's saying a lot.
I am not. That's dude. That's what is so crazy. I think so. Like we had stated, not a fruit punch guy. Especially like it's like cotton candy. It's androgynous sweet. The Kool-Aid tropical punch, like that may be my favorite Rise energy drink flavor. It's that good. Now they do have 2 flavors that I really want to get my hands on, and I'm going to be looking actually later today to see if I can. But they have sour punch straws. They have a green and a blue sour punch straw flavor, and both of those just sound like they're going to be dangerous.
Yes, I've had both of those. Very good.
See, like that's what I'm talking about.
Better. I like the green a little bit better. They're both really good. Again, I'm gonna crack the Sunny D one tomorrow. See what that's talking about. Yeah, really good, dude. Rise does good shit. From their pre-workout to their energy drinks to their protein.
Really their protein is very good. That complex that they have with like it's like a little bit of whey, a little bit of concentrate, a little bit of isolate, and then I think they have a slight amount of casein, like only like 3 to 4 grams, but it's enough that if you were to use it in like a bakery item, it flows through nice. Mm-hmm. So overall, guys, we appreciate you guys coming on and listening to this today. It's been a really fun one. You guys know where to find us on Instagram, on YouTube. Make sure you like and subscribe, follow us, buy something at bedboys.com. It's the greatest website ever. So I think that's it, but we'll see you in the next one.
Until next time, guys. Peace.
Peace.